Hello and welcome to the Dicerra podcast, where our passion is human performance in healthcare and aviation. Today, very excited to have Billie Flynn, who is a legend in Canadian aviation. In fact, a legend in aviation internationally. A former fighter pilot from the Canadian Air Force, a former commanding officer of 441 Squadron, a test pilot, both on the civilian side and on the military side, having been involved in test programs with the Eurofighter and more recently the F-35. Flown over 80 different types of aircraft. Just an incredible flying career that I think anybody who is involved in aviation would be envious of. So I'm going to turn it over to Billie to give a bit of an introduction. Obviously, I've only given the Cliff's Notes, and there's a lot more to it than that. But before I do, I'll just recognize that this year is the 25th anniversary of Operation Allied Force in Kosovo, and Billie was the commanding officer of the Canadian Fighter Force for Operation Allied Force. So Billie, if you don't mind, maybe you can give us a little bit of a background, what took you from the early days of aviation through to being the commander of the fighter force and Allied Force, and then from that point onwards to being now a leading authority on the F-35.
Sure, TK. Thanks for the invite to come chat today. I look forward to talking about all things aviation and wherever this goes. Look, I started luckily having a father who was a fighter pilot. He flew F-86 Sabres, and by the time I knew to look at airplanes, he was flying CF-100s and then 101 Voodoos. I grew up in fighter bases, and on Sundays, as I like to say, after church, we'd go to the hangar and sit in fighter jets and play around, my brother and I. And oh, by the way, my dad would give us the cookies and the juices that were supplied to them by the Air Force, which, 30 years later, when I was a squadron commander, they were the same cookies and the same juices that were supplied by the military for snacks. And I grew up around jets, and I assume now that that's what I always wanted to do. I ended up in the military college system in Canada at CMR, south of Montreal, for 3 years, and then for an engineering degree at RMC in Kingston. I'm blessed with, throughout my career, incredible impatience, but extraordinary timing. I went to pilot training, and I came out of there selected as the guinea pig, the first pipeliner in the United States. We call them nuggets, to the first pipeliner picked to fly the CF-18 even before we had the aircraft in country. I was told secretly I was going to be the guy, and came out of there, went to Cold Lake, Alberta, bided my time impatiently, and then fit into the course that became course number 1 on the CF-18 on the first squadron, which is 409. My lists of firsts of lucky positions went on. First alert out of baggage fill because the tail cracks happened and our squadrons rolled a 6-month delay. First person to go out chase a bear off the coast of Newfoundland, didn't park at some ungodly hour, and 4 a.m. by myself because my flight lead aborted. First deployment to Europe of the CF-18, again because of the delays. When we went and populated the 3 squadrons, replaced them, the 3 squadrons of 104s with CF-18s. I did cool things over there, like I flew the CF-18 at the Paris Air Show in 1987. We'll come back to why that matters later on. And then I got picked to test pilot school and patiently wanted to go. I made the mistake early in my career of reading the book The Right Stuff, which just the bug of those guys were godlike, the Chuck Yeager era, Scott Crossfield, and every one of that era of test pilots where they were bearing guys, once every couple of weeks, certainly once a month, but they did amazing things in the world of exploration and discovery, and I wanted to be one of them. I am blessed with the audacity of hope, as Barack Obama used to call it. My enthusiasm overcomes my defects. I was a stunningly bad student at military college. The only thing I cared about was varsity football and having fun in Kingston and not paying attention. And I did wake up at some point and realize if you want to be a fighter pilot, you need to be number 1 and you need to study. So I took that. But those bad marks carried me right through to selection test pilot school. And after many tries to get in, eventually the career managers gave up, sent me to Pax River to go to the U.S. Navy test pilot school. And from there, again, extraordinary timing. The exchange officer at Edwards Air Force Base at the time, decided that there was nothing left to do in the F-16. It was about 23 years into the life of the F-16. He thought that was all over, and he retired and went to Air Canada. And so I left. I was pulled out of Pax River after grad and sent to Edwards Air Force Base to live an extraordinary 5 years, flying the F-16, flying with NASA down the road. You call it NASA Armstrong now. Back then it was NASA Dryden. I did thrust vectoring in the F-16. I flew the F-18 that had thrust vectoring paddles. I flew against the X-31 that had thrust vectoring paddles. I flew in an F-18, lived an extraordinary life there. Back to Canada, hated my life on the ground. And then again, extraordinary timing. The commanding officer of one of the squadrons went to Air Canada. And I out of nowhere, I was picked to become the CEO of 441 Squadron. A very storied, an incredible history of the squadron. And I always hated them when I wasn't on them. And all of a sudden I became the commanding officer of the Silver Foxes. And oh, by the way, foxes eat eggs. And so I spent 2 years as commanding officer eating lots of raw eggs in social events. And again, extraordinary timing. My squadron became the lead squadron and rolled into the timing that ultimately had us deploy 3 days before combat broke out in Operation Allied Force. I'll come back to that later. I retired at the end of my squadron commander tour, hired or poached to go fly Eurofighter Typhoon. I did that for 4 years in Munich, Germany, of the four-nation consortium at the beginning of its lifetime in the very dark days of Eurofighter. And then F-35 was won by Lockheed, and I had a great relationship back to my F-16 days at Edwards, and was hired by Lockheed first to fly F-16E and F models. They were sold to the United Arab Emirates. We call them Block 60. 2 years of research doing automatic ground collision avoidance at NASA Dryden in an F-16 as part of a skunkworks team. Legendary work by the team to mature the technologies of automatic ground collision avoidance, which we'll probably come to talk to. And then F-35 for 10 years. I live at Pax River, Maryland. When I'm here in the States is where I was posted for 10 years. I flew all three models. I was the global spokesman for the F-35, first F-35 air show in 2017 at the Paris Air Show, 30 years after I'd been there in the CF-18, and had an amazing career in every part of F-35's development, and now blessed to live a normal life with my family. I'd say my life is much fuller, much broader than it was in the 40 years of flying. And I'm lucky to transition to this place now, and happy to chat today about all things F-35, but also, you know, the world of aviation, safety, and all those things I've learned just by experience, certainly not by wisdom, but by experience in the different cultures that I've been a part of. So that's the very long introduction to where I come from.
I have a lot of questions from that. First, I should say for the listeners that aren't aware, the bear that Billy was talking about chasing was a Russian bomber and not the four-legged variety.
That's right.
But I assume that people listening are aware. When you were working on the Auto GCAS project, we had a test pilot up on an exchange here from the USAF fairly recently, Casey Fletch Richardson, who was also heavily involved in the Auto GCAS. I guess you must have crossed paths perhaps with him while you were on the project.
So let's get a little bit of history. I remember listening to research papers of groups at Edwards Air Force Base, so Air Force based. When I say Air Force, I'm always talking about the US Air Force. Air Force-based research projects, trying to mature the technology and trying to get it into aircraft. And if you go back 25 years or 30 years ago, they had the technology, but the hardware was cumbersome and it was uber expensive to go retrofit airplanes. And we were killing a lot of guys, but the conversation just wasn't compelling enough to leaders when they had to offset, you know, weapons and new airplane technologies with what was effectively thought of as just a better safety belt or an airbag. And it just didn't earn its way into the fighter community back then. And in 2009, I was pulled from regular flying at Lockheed Martin to be part of the skunkworks team matched with the Air Force Research Labs, AFRL, here in the United States. And then NASA Dryden, so the NASA Flight Research Facility at Edwards Air Force Base, where there were experts that had spent years working on this technology. And these teams all knew each other, but we were put together. We were given a two-seat F-16, and our mandate was go mature the technologies. And at that time, luckily for us, technologies like really sophisticated navigation that came with GPS mixed with inertial navigation systems. So you know what it is, but to your listeners, it's our ability to use the GPS that you effectively have in your iPhone, which didn't really exist before. All of a sudden, we had great position. We knew where we were because the GPS was really accurate. Everybody has Google Earth at home on their computers, or even I have it on my iPhone. But go back many years, the terrain of the Earth wasn't really well understood. And even in the military world, where they thought they had very classified, sophisticated terrain mapping, they really didn't. And we managed to take technology that came from a space shuttle mission, STS-99, if I remember, that did the shuttle radar topography mission, where it mapped essentially 95% of the Earth's surface. And it took years to mature the data, but all of a sudden we had flawless terrain database. So we knew where we were, right? We have GPS in our iPhones or in our jets. And all of a sudden we had amazing technology for the terrain we were flying over. And then we worked on the technology to make sure that the airplane knew as it was flying along, was it going to hit the ground? And if it thought it was going to hit the ground, how would it maneuver to take control away from the pilot and then fly away? And all of a sudden, in a 2-year period, we matured the technology that had been worked on for 25 years, introduced it first to the F-16, then in a version sort of in F-22, but a really good version in F-35. And to date, we have saved, I'm sure we're 15 F-16 lives, 14 F-16s. You can do that math. That means there's a two-seat F-16 in there where both pilots were incapacitated. We've saved F-22s, we've saved F-35s. The conversation is so compelling that it's being put into the Super Hornet fleet and ultimately even into the Canadian legacy CF-18 fleet. And it will change for the rest of our aviation lives. Aircraft will no longer hit the ground. And I work now, many of us who worked on it in the test world, volunteer our time and are working on a civilian application of this that'll go in light airplanes like somebody's Piper Cub or somebody's Cessna 412. Just fascinating part of that. And everybody that's been a part of it, and many of the Canadian exchange officers have been a part of it in the F-16 world. Everybody's part of this chorus now that has had a little bit of time in the development of it, and we all sing the praises, and we're out there telling the story so that we help people understand just what this really means to the aviation world and safety from now on.
Yeah, as recently as 10 years ago, I think it was circa 2014. I was down in Arizona for a det, and we were flying in the Baghdad and Gladden models that are owned by Nellis, and there was an F-16 that had a CFET control flight to rain for our listeners. That was deemed after the fact to be a G-LOC, so gene-induced loss of consciousness. For those who are listening, blood is pulled from your head under G-load, lose consciousness, lose control of the aircraft, and the aircraft was lost that day, killing the pilot and losing the F-16, and that was only 10 years ago. Roughly, give or take. So I imagine that and the F-16 would have been the driver for adopting this technology that's now proliferating into the other platforms. And is that right?
I don't know. I guess I'm going to say it because we started with the F-16 as a platform, and we were the Lockheed Martin company. It was an easy platform to pick for us to go test on. And the experience leading up there, up to the point where that I joined the program, had been at Edwards using F-16 platforms. I mean, hypothetically, we could have grabbed a two-seat F-15, but we also needed a digital flight control system initially to put it on. So it just became the platform to use. And then as part of our development, we had the United States Air Force program guys, so that people that run the F-16 were part of our program overseeing things. And my input all along was, it's great to do this research, but it better go in the hands of the operators. And in fact, it took another 2 years after I was done before it ended up in the fleet, so in the operational world, and we killed 2 more guys in that time period just because we couldn't get it in fast enough. And then in the F-35, it wasn't going to go in until right about now. And some great work by test pilots in the United States Air Force with some help from us. We leapfrogged the program plan, found a way to shoehorn it in the F-35, and we've saved lives in the F-35 already. And lives you can't replace, and there's no price tag to put on that. But we're saving millions upon millions of dollars of airplanes that would have been lost also in this effort.
That's an awesome system. I like to say if it proliferates onto general aviation aircraft as well, it's going to have a huge effect across the whole industry.
That's what's going on right now. You'll have the equivalent of an iPhone. It won't be I'm an iPhone guy, but it'll be an Android phone probably to start, but a presentation that'll tell you when you're flying in your Cessna 182 that looks ahead and says, hey, you're coming against a wall up here. You need to pull up now, and it'll know your power, or you need to turn left to avoid the threat on the right-hand side. And everybody will be able to slap this on their airplane and fly with it at some point. And we will not be running into the ground like we have historically at some point, hopefully in the nearer future than not.
Pretty cool to be a part of a program that's saving lives like that, because so often in military test, your stores release, you're at the opposite end, rather than looking at the how do we insulate our pilots and potentially general aviation pilots from risk. You're kind of looking at how do we optimize a weapon configuration. So it's pretty cool to be a part of both. Also pretty cool to have seen the F-16 and the F-35, and to be able to make a distinction between 4.5 Gen Block 60 F-16 and then the shift towards what is considered 5th gen. And I am by no means an expert on that. I think you are, and so I'd like to hear it more from you. But maybe before we get there, you mentioned, you gave us a pretty quick, actually, sweep over a really impressive career. And you mentioned that you were lucky as far as timing goes, and you were really fortunate to have had the amazing career that you've had. But of course, that's two sides of the same coin. There's the fortune of being able to do those things, but there's the huge challenge that goes along with actually being able to execute them. And any one of a number of things in your career is a huge challenge that would have been, very difficult to strive and achieve and do well at. What would you say is, if you had to pick one or two, your biggest challenges that you had to overcome in your career?
Besides legendary impatience, besides astonishingly poor marks and poor study habits that before I started my routine. I'll tell you what I think are the positives in a sense, and rather than challenges, and that is, I never believed there were margins to hold me in. I didn't know when I picked up the book, The Right Stuff, that a Canadian could never go to Edwards Air Force Base and do the things I did. I didn't know, I didn't believe anybody that said, oh, if you go to test pilot school, your career is over and you'll never amount to anything. You'll be stuck in that world forever. I just didn't believe the naysayers out there. And it is, again, to go back to a Barack Obama quote, the audacity of hope. And I had a passion. And I was managed to overcome bad study habits because my enthusiasm overcame my defects, and I loved this world. And it is, flying fighters was my drug of choice for more than 40 years. And it was my motivation. And I learned through mistakes. I'm not a gifted pilot at all, and I nearly failed early in pilot training, but I learned resilience to overcome that. I learned about elasticity of skill sets, and I just wasn't going to give up. And And I think because I loved it so much, that's what helped me know that I would go spend more time in the simulator than everyone else, that my study habits were different than everyone else, but I needed to broaden my skill set because I always believed that there was chaos out there. And I just wasn't going to believe that on every single day, things were going to work out magically well for me. And so I think I armed myself with in a sense of fear or insecurity, but really with the understanding that if I wanted to be good, if I wanted to excel, I had to try harder than everyone else. And I just loved it. And I guess that makes it easy. And that's not a very thoughtful answer to it all. But in the end, as I go back 4 decades of it, there is no more bigger thrill for me that in the last 10 years to strap on an F-35 and go flying. My worst day was better than most every other day in lots of other worlds. So I think that carried me a long, long way.
Being passionate about what you do can make up for a lot of the pain. Okay? Um, to drill down into that a little bit, you had a blog where you talked about, the early days of your pilot training on the Musketeer and how that shaped your ability to bounce back and be more resilient. You mentioned, the difference between Gladwell's approach to the 10,000 hour rule versus deliberate practice, which I found really interesting. Can you explain what you mean by deliberate practice and how that could be applied in any career choice? Aviation is one, but a healthcare professional, a surgeon, a doctor, an athlete can apply deliberate practice.
Or a musician. So for everyone that many people have read Malcolm Gladwell's books, I love them all. Pop culture sociologist. And in the book his book Outliers, he talks about the 10,000 hour rule. And he applies, it basically says to be a master in anything, you need to have practiced it or done it for 10,000 hours. And his example was the group The Beatles, which some of your listeners actually certainly weren't born when they played. But the Beatles played in Germany for many, many hours, for years, in bars before they ever came back to the UK and became known. And his thesis essentially says, you got to practice and do the grunt work before you can be good at that. All of that I believe, is true. You have to do the work. You have to spend the time. But if all you're going to do every day is go to a simulator and do the same thing, or fly the same patterns, or go to the weight room and do the same thing every time, or as a musician, you're going to play the same music day in, day out, you're not going to get better. And Anders Ericsson's book about peak performance talks about something that I did for a lifetime, but I didn't have a name for it. I didn't have a theme to link it to or a thesis to tie it to. And that is, when you go to practice your music, or when you go to the weight room, or when you train in the pool as a swimmer, or as a pilot, you train flying and do simulation, you work on very specific skills and you work for very specific conditions to make yourself better each time. And so as a pilot, I wouldn't go to the simulator and just do the same thing as everyone else. I would go and I'd do the stuff that needed repetition, but I'd go practice the abnormal things. I'd learn to fly without the instruments that everybody else was used to flying. And I'd struggle through the simulator to learn how to adapt to that, to get myself, I don't know, back on the ground when my heads-up display failed or my platform failed. And in the simulator, as an airshow pilot, I worked on all the emergencies possible, every combination that is not imaginable. And I would do that so that I would create, the term I use is elasticity. I would do things out of the norm. So when bad things happened, I may not have done that exact thing in my non-standard simulator practice, but I would have done something abnormal enough that I would have been able to reach over and go, oh, you know what? Things are going really bad right now. And it's kind of like what I was working on in the simulator 2 weeks ago, and I sort of know what to do. And I've created the term is elasticity. I wouldn't have done exactly the same thing, but I certainly would have done more than the norm. And that allowed my skill set to get very focused and ultimately for me to be far better than if I just gone in and, done the time. And here's the example I'll use. Most everybody remembers an Air France flight that went from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Air France 447 was an airliner flying from Brazil back to Paris, and they ran into a major problem up high at altitude where the sensors, we'll just, you know what it is, and I do, but the sensors froze, and effectively the aircraft stalled. The captain was in the back resting. A ferry pilot was in the left seat. The co-pilot was in the right seat. The aircraft effectively stalled at high altitude and fell a long way down till ultimately hit the water and killed everybody. It was a long way down, minutes. And the pilot was awakened, came to the front, and the pilot and the ferry pilot tried to figure out what was happening. And all the efforts they exercised, they did to recover the airplane. What they didn't know is that the pilot in the right seat, the co-pilot, had his hand on the stick, the side stick, and was pulling back the entire time because in his mind, he was trying to fly away. And it defeated everything that the pilots, the captain and the other pilot in the left seat were trying to do. And so everyone died. And the example I use is that pilot, co-pilot in the right seat, because he had been trained and he'd gone to he'd done his simulator time and he certainly had been flying, but he clearly had not done, worked at out of the norm situations. And so when something chaotic happened, the only thing he knew to do was what he'd been trained in the very normal, very tight margin world that he trained to. And he didn't know enough to let go of the stick. And if he'd let go of the stick, the captain would have been able to fly the aircraft away from the problem ultimately, and fly away, and no one would have died. And I keep coming back to that example. There are examples in the test world of a very famous X-plane, the X-31, and it crashed because the control room of engineers and the pilot didn't know what to do when things went bad on them, and they didn't recognize the situation. And the pilot especially had not practiced, had not done his work, had not done things abnormal in his simulations and his training, and was clueless on what to do. He could have saved the airplane, and instead he ejected, broke his back, and the aircraft was lost. There are many, many cases like that. So for me, 10,000 hour rule says, yes, do the work, but peak performance says deliberate practice is how you're going to excel and how you're going to perfect what you're attempting to master.
Some interesting research out there on the role of heuristics in situational awareness. And a lot of it comes from fighter pilots. There's a good Singaporean study in their F-16 pilots about what separates a junior wingman from an experienced fighter weapons guy in terms of level 3 situational awareness, really being able to project out ahead of what's happening in the aircraft right now to what its current state will be and what the consequences are of future decisions. And they found the biggest separator was the experienced pilots had built heuristics, and they might not map perfectly onto the scenario that they're seeing in the aircraft on that occasion, like you're describing, but I've seen something similar enough develop maybe that elasticity that their working memory resources are far lower to solve the problem. They've got a basic heuristic that they can kind of fall back on, and then they can build on that. And the gap between that heuristic and the current situation is much smaller than the novice who's got nothing. Maybe the basic training under very prescribed scenarios, and then you have this significant working memory resource of trying to absorb information, process it, and make a decision all at the same time while flying the aircraft. It doesn't lead to the same outcomes as the more experienced folks. I think it's really interesting that you're drilling down to, you can still be experienced, you can have thousands of hours, but if you've only been practicing inside the box, when something outside the box happens, all of that experience can still lead you to fly an aircraft into the ocean and kill everybody on board.
You asked me about the difference between 4.5 gen fighters and 5th gen fighters. I took it off on a tangent. It's funny, when I came in, I'll go on one more tangent and then I'm going to answer what your question. When I joined as that pipeliner in the beginning of the 4th gen world in the Canadian Air Force, we'd had second gen fighters, right? We'd had CF-101 Voodoos, we had CF-104 Starfighters, and we had the baby jet, the CF-5, which is a 1950s design, 1960s built airplane. And really, we missed an entire generation, third gen airplanes, the F4 being the iconic airplane from that. We had a big leap to make. And we had a aircraft that was powered by, you're going to love this, and you probably know this, 2 Commodore 64K equivalent mission computers. It was worth 18 million to 25 million in the day. It was uber expensive. We called it the plastic jet. It did magical things, and I represented a new generation that knew nothing else but 3 digital display indicators and a heads-up display as a primary flight instrument. And that was so different than the pilots who had flown second-gen fighters and were transitioning. And the example I often say that 4 years in to the operational use of the F-18, we, the pipeliners, were dramatically better than the older guys because we didn't have to learn. All we knew was fourth gen and how to fly a fourth gen multi-role fighter that was a plastic jet and did amazing things. And they had to unlearn their second gen habits to then try to catch up to fourth gen. And very few really were ever able to do that. When we step now into fifth gen, so F-22, a very limited cadre that flew it for the United States Air Force, 189 of them built, and really a very closed world, uniquely United States Air Force. We really didn't get enough folks out there to teach us. We knew it was powerful, but F-35 broadens. There's soon to be 1,000 F-35s flying, and more than 1,000 pilots have flown the jet. And what we know is that my leap, my experience, remember, second gen to fourth gen, is the same thing we're seeing with fourth gen to fifth gen. The massive leap forward, in this case, the astonishing amounts of information presented to pilots on effectively a big touchscreen TV, which is essentially what it is, and in front of, on the mask of a $400,000 US, by the way, $400,000 US helmet that we wear, the extraordinary amount of sensor data that's given to the pilot, and how they manage that. And I can fly an F-35, and I can go out in a formation and kill the enemy 20 to 1. And we all that flew F-35 have done those things because the airplane carries the day. People that are true fifth gen Jedi Knights grow up in the F-35, and they go out there and they're always survivable. They always are effective, and they are astonishingly lethal. And then they are better to 20 to 1 than their adversaries every single time. And a youngin, man or woman, gets into an F-35 now, and there's really 4 steps that distinguish the trait that is a fifth gen baby. They metabolize all the data, so they take it all in, all of it all. They filter, so they look down there on that massive screen, that massive video game, and they throw away the ones that are important. They know who the good guys are, and they focus on the bad guys. They prioritize, so big screen. Now there's lots of bad guys. They prioritize. So just because someone's close to you doesn't mean they're the biggest threat, because you're smart enough to know who's really going to harm you or not. And then they execute. They execute their mission. And that may mean killing all the bad guys, or that may mean avoiding the bad guys who can't see you because you're a stealthy platform and you're invisible, and then taking care of the target wherever it is. But whatever that is, they execute. So they metabolize, they filter, they prioritize, and they execute. And a fifth gen baby who doesn't know an F-16, who's never flown a Boeing Super Hornet, never been in a grip in a Eurofighter, an F-15, doesn't have any of those bad habits. And back in those fourth gen days, we were the fusion algorithm. We were the machine that had to gather all the data of 4 different screens and a helmet and poorly presented information, poorly presented data, and put it all together and figure out what to do. And oh, by the way, we had to talk to each other on the radios, and none of that's done now. It's done by a algorithm that tells us who the good guys or the bad guys are. We know it's so sophisticated that we trust it every time. And a fifth gen baby gets in there and eats it up, and is so much more lethal than any of us, as good as pilots as we may be, whatever the age group, as we transition from fourth gen to fifth gen. we will never be as good as the 5th-gen babies, which is, I don't know, go back 40 years. The old guys were never going to be as good as my peers, maybe not me, my peers were as 4th-gen babies in the Hornet. And that's really what distinguishes it. It's not about flying the airplane. It's about being incredibly survivable and lethal with all the knowledge that's presented to the pilot in the cockpit.
I've never heard it put that way. The metabolize, filter, prioritize, execute for 5th-gen. That's a big takeaway for me. And I have, again, so many questions. So how do you select for 5th-gen pilots? If you're trying to design, aircrew aptitude selection, moment, the CAF has adopted and is modifying a version of the RAF aircrew aptitude test, the RAFAT, for the Canadian Forces. We've kind of replaced CAPS that I went through many, many moons ago, and it's prioritized executive function because even before 5th-gen, I think folks started to recognize there's a lot more data in the cockpit, even just with your digital displays than perhaps there was in the past. And maybe if you have some kind of proxy for measuring your executive function in terms of inhibiting, updating, shifting, can you suppress irrelevant stimuli, prioritize what needs to be done, not get channelized attention, be able to divide your attention amongst multiple displays and so on. But they're all substandard approaches. They're just proxy tests, and we do the best we can with selection. And then you go through training, and you would have trained probably from the Musketeer through the Tudor, and you flying the F5 at 419, and then the Hornet. Nowadays, of course, guys do the T6, the Hawk, or they used to up until very recently, and then the Hornet, and now it'll be, maybe the PC-21 soon, some version of an outcan posting to either Italy, Finland, or the US for a phase 4 flit, and then coming back to the F-35. So we're going to get guys ultimately are on the same squadron, but have flown, excuse me, very different aircraft types, whether it's the Air Macchi 346 or the Hawk T2 or the T-38. I assume the training product, in terms of the syllabus, the amount of AI missions you do, the amount of ACM, DFM, and so on, will be roughly comparable, but the platform's very different, and maybe the culture of the training environment is quite different as well. Do you have any, I don't know, maybe advice for the Canadian Forces and other air forces, having flown everything from, F5s and Tudors all the way through Block 60, F-16, and now F-35? Is there a big difference, you think, in the quality of the candidate that's moving on to an F-35 coming off a 346 Air Macchi versus a T-38? Or does it start way before that in terms of the selection of who we even send to those platforms?
Let's talk about selection and some ideas about that. And then let's talk about how we produce a product for that. I have studied different ideas of how to weed people up and select them and mentor them through their development. And think of European football, soccer, and soccer academies in Spain or Italy, where they pick up young kids at, I don't know, 11, 12, 13, 14, even 14 might be too late. And they put them in academies and they watch them and they track them with data now, and they follow them through the careers. And the analytics can tell them, even though you and I intuitively could watch some kid and think he's better than everyone else, but the data, as they follow them through their development, will show who are the kids who are going to be rock stars, and shows at least the talent element of that. And I wondered, we've looked at this, myself and some other researchers, of how you would apply this in a military context when you pick up a candidate as they join the military and you start tracking them through their career progression through the courses, certainly in flying. And do we see, rock star talent early on, and what's out there that would help us do that? And as much as I think there would be utility to that, there's some intangibles that really matter. We're talking about fighter pilots, not airline pilots. And what do I care about? Well, I care about going to war. And what I really care about is building war fighters and ultimately warriors, which is not the same as a war fighter. I can send someone to combat. They can fight in some operation, but it doesn't make them a warrior. What I want is to build warfighters and as many warriors as I can. And there comes the intangible. There comes the courage and the character that comes from someone under stress, under real stress of someone shooting at you, and your job's to go out and kill bad guys. And so this notion of a soccer academy process of weeding people out and using data analytics to help that kind of falls apart when it's the intangibles of who's the guy on the football team that is the leader, that you saw his stats and he wasn't that fast and he wasn't that strong, yet he's ferocious on a soccer field or on a football field or on the hockey ice in the rink. And I've seen that in 40 years of all those countries I've flown in and all the cultures. I've seen these guys who just don't look the part, that they're not the Tom Cruises and the Val Kilmers. The girls aren't hanging around them at bars. But when it came to combat, they were astonishing. They were warriors. And so I'm not sure how I can select now. Let's pick. Okay, so I'd throw that out there. Let's talk about what I expect from this generation and what people think of this generation, and then and see where we go from this. Because old people, that would be all of my era, and even the generation behind, have no time for this gig economy. The Gen Z crowd and soon the Gen Alpha crowd. They're not loyal to anything. The gig economy, they're going from one good job to the next. They don't have the same work ethic as we did. They live on iPhones or on their phones or head down all day. They're multitasking. They don't pay attention to anything. And the reality is that all that might be true. And we have 4 boys aged 20 to 30. So we're pretty clear about all those bad habits of all that generation. But we also understand that they can do things in a fighter jet or in a space vehicle or in a helicopter or any flying vehicle in combat that no other generation before them could. And because they can do those 4 things: metabolize, filter, prioritize, and execute more efficiently, more effectively than any other human ever. And I also believe that when you start firing bullets at them and they go to combat, they're going to be no different than my generation was, or the generation before me, or the generation before that. And they're actually going to deliver, and they're going to show up, and they're going to be as lethal, as survivable, as effective as any other generation before. And I say that without any data, but I can tell you that my father and my friends who are fighter pilots, their fathers of the same era, never thought we'd ever amount to anything. We didn't work as hard as them. We didn't study as hard. We played around too much. And, bunch of this generation did okay. And so I look at the gig economy crowd, the Gen Z crowd, and go, cut them some slack. When people start shooting at them, they're going to amount to something. So I don't know how you filter them out. I do believe that there's courage and character that's required in there. And I think we sell them short, and we just haven't seen them under the stresses. And when we do, we'll see that they're very, very capable. So I don't know a perfect answer. I do know this about the example you used, and I just wrote a blog about it, which is really me taking a shot at the Royal Canadian Air Force for canceling sovereign fighter pilot lead-in training and farming it out to the United States, to Italy, and to Finland. What I know is that we take guys off the street like you, like me, like everyone we know in all the services, run-of-the-mill men and women, and we put them in a system, and we teach them these things, and we teach them how to fly, and we teach them responsibility and independent decision-making. We give them astonishing responsibility incredibly early in life at an incredibly early rank level, and they excel. And they make mistakes, and we reel them in when they make mistakes, but then we let them out again. We have a leash on them, and all of a sudden they can assume the responsibility. Look, you watch a commander of a tanker, a U.S. Air Force KC-10 tanker, who ferries jets across the Pacific and the Atlantic on any given day of the week. And I've been a part of 15 transatlantic hops in my career. And you see a 29-year-old who's in charge of his tanker airplane, a KC-10, dragging 6 F-16s from Fort Worth, Texas to Sevilla, Spain, and then the next 2 days later from Spain all the way to the Middle East. And he's a 29-year-old in charge of the lives and the operation of 6 fighter jets and a tanker airplane, just as one example. And that's the kind of transformation that we accomplish in our militaries, bringing kids off the street and, turning them into amazing adults. And I really think that our system is incredibly good at that. And so finish this last tangent, bring fighter pilot trainees back from the United States, back from Italy, and back from Finland, and Canadianize them, give them responsibility early on, teach them how to think independently, and we're going to turn them into amazing pilots for the future.
I couldn't agree more. I spent a lot of time in the training system as an instructor, and I saw some changes in recent years with the approach to training and the resources that were available, and not all training in the right direction. I think that's a thread I'd like to pull at. Maybe we can circle back to it at the end if we have time. But I also want to talk a little bit about the warriorship comment. And it might be a nice segue into Op Allied Force as well. I remember, in your blog about Op Allied Force, some references to preparation and equipment procurement for NVGs prior to going into theater. And it made me think about some of the great bosses that I've had in the past who were absolute warriors and who were kind of the friction in an organization that the superiors didn't necessarily appreciate all the time because they're a squeaky wheel. And in peacetime, those warriors can be, peacetime can be a hard place for a warrior when you're operationally minded and you have perspective on what needs to be done, but you're perceived as kind of a nuisance to those who would prefer to just keep things status quo. And then I can think of bosses that were the opposite, the ultimate peacetime staff officer. And there's a big difference between the two.